to my webinar that's going to be focusing on participation in child protection proceedings. My name's Jo Dillon and I'm a lecturer at Sheffield University in the Social Work Department, and I've been an enthusiastic attender of the Children as Human Rights Defenders at CO over the past couple of years. So I'm delighted to be invited to present this webinar today, and I'm hopefully going to be looking at how we encourage meaningful participation when children are not willing participants, and child protection social work is often a very good example of this. Now, just to explain a little bit about my background, my passion for participation began over 20 years ago whilst I was working for a youth homeless charity in Blackpool in the northwest of England. The young people were constantly at the heart of our service. So when we were creating newsletters, funding applications, marketing materials, or recruitment procedures, they were always involved and the systems were always co-produced. Fast forward a few years, in 2005, I became the participation manager for Connections in Lancashire. And part of my job was to embed the National Youth Agency Hereby Right standards into the organisation. However, I found it really difficult. So, for example, whilst my young people were expected to attend the board meetings, the meetings were often held in very remote locations, so out in the countryside, late in the evening and taking place on weekdays, and the children who were meant to attend were aged 13, 14 and found these times and places very inaccessible. While we were there, board members used jargon and acronyms that were unfamiliar to the young people, and the young people came away feeling very unincluded. Fast forward again a few more years, and I then qualified as a social worker and went to work in frontline children's services. Now, I've been researching in this field for the past 7 years, and this was born partly out of frustration due to my practice not being as good as it could, and working out that there had to be a better way to do things. So let's start by having a look at research and the findings from research that can help us with regards to understanding participation in child protection social work. So first of all, we need to remember that mostly a child's presence in child protection is involuntary. So a child may not know that they're going to become the subject of a child protection investigation until they find a social worker perhaps sitting on their couch in their home or coming to visit them in school. Now, this must be a really big deal for a child, especially younger children who may not be able to ask questions on the spot. I mean, even introducing this webinar, you heard me get flustered when I'm trying to think of the right things to say at the right time. So how can a child think how to answer our questions at the drop of a hat? And we've got to remember here that there's an immediate power imbalance. We haven't been invited into the child's home or even to have a conversation with them, and yet the child is expected to participate in their own child protection investigation or social work assessments moving forward. So right from the very start in social work, we need to be thinking how we can reduce this power imbalance and how we can then allow and encourage meaningful participation. So the protection participation imbalance has been one of the discussions about the nature and meaning of childhood for a long time, and research has noted that practitioners' constructs of childhood might affect their perception of children as being either autonomous or vulnerable. And research has again identified practitioners as following maybe two different approaches. So, for example, the rescue approach, which is geared around protecting the child and perhaps not very supportive of the participation of children and young people. And the other would be the rights approach, which is very supportive of participation. So this social actor perspective seeks out the strengths of the child and hopefully uses their experience of the child protection journey as a resource and a meaningful contribution to the child's own child protection plan. Now we have to remember that child participation can be enhanced by building good relationships with children's parents. So parents are perceptive to possibly an accusatorial stance from their social worker because they're the subject of child protection allegations as well as being the child's parent, and this can leave them feeling excluded and powerless. So we need to recognise that parents themselves can often be the barrier to their child's own participation in child protection planning. Therefore, we as social workers and practitioners, we need the time to build relationships with the child's caregivers as well as the child. And this social worker parent partnership is enshrined in the Children Act 1989, which is the UK's most prominent child protection legislation. And that's key. We need to be working in partnership with parents. We must have a partnership approach to be able to embed participation into child protection social work. Now, research conducted with children on child protection plans is really rare. The majority of previous research studies have been undertaken with either looked after children or their associated practitioners, or possibly with young adults reflecting on their experience within the child protection looked after child journey. I don't know why studies with children on child protection plans are so rare. Perhaps it's due to the fast-paced, risk-focused nature of children's social work. Because sometimes practitioners have very new relationships with children and often limited time and training in which they can actually think about embedding meaningful participation into their practice. As practitioners, we need to consider how we are sharing and what we are sharing with or about the child. So, for example, issuing reports to children with redacted or blacked out information is really harmful because the child may overly speculate what's being hidden from them. What they're thinking about what's being hidden may actually be more harmful than what actually is being hidden from them. We also need to consider sharing information about children with people who may be there to support children, but the information we're sharing may be not appropriate. And we need to be always asking children what is appropriate information to share on their behalf. Finally, we need to consider how we can provide advocacy for children. And advocacy should be available to all children and young people on child protection plans in England. But this is often a bit sketchy due to the money available and local authority resources. Now, research tells us that advocacy services are crucial when we're embedding the voice of children into decision-making forums, particularly when hard-pressed social workers are unable to focus specifically on this. There's also very, very little evidence of parents having their own advocates in child protection proceedings also. So for the webinar today, I am going to be focusing on the findings of my research, but really just to promote discussion and to think about how we can promote and embed participation by changing tiny aspects of our practice with children. So we're going to look at the bigger picture, but then think about the little things we can change to make children feel they can speak and be heard at all times in the social work journey. Now, over the past 3 years, I've been working with 3 local authorities in England, talking to children who are on child protection plans, very young children actually, aged between 8 and 12 years. I've been talking to parents who have at least one child on a child protection plan, social workers who are working in child protection, and also a few participation workers who are required to go out and undertake what in England we refer to as wishes and feelings work with children. And we're going to look at this a little bit more in depth. Now, working and doing research with very young children is a hot topic, I guess. And I know that some researchers in the past have decided not to work with very young children for fear of saying things that may upset them, or revealing information, or making them think about things that's sensitive and maybe upsetting as well. However, for my research, I thought it was really important. For example, if a young child is seeing the presence of more practitioners such as doctors, nurses, police officers, health visitors, special educational needs coordinators visiting their home, they may wonder why this is happening all of a sudden, and it may reassure them to know that it's being done as a result of a plan put in place to support them and their families. Now, with regards to my research, I tried to make it as participatory as possible. And I thought, whilst I'm not going to try and focus on my research, with it being a participation topic, I thought it might be handy to share some of the things that I did with the children to make them feel that I was really listening to them whilst I was interviewing them. So I developed a treasure chest of resources, and these were just a few examples of the resources I pulled together to work with the children and young people, and they were allowed to choose anything that they wanted to represent themselves, their families, people they worked with. We had bundles and bundles of emoji cards, which you may be able to see me highlighting with my cursor here. We had toys, dolls, emoji cards, pens, papers, more stickers, glitter. They could design the resources that they chose to describe how they were feeling whilst they were being worked with by a social worker while they were on a child protection plan. So my next slide should be an example of a work that I did with a young person to try and make sense of their core group of professionals, because in England, when children are on a child protection plan, we assemble a support network that can keep children safe, that can provide extra support to parents who are finding things a little bit difficult at the moment, and who can help keep the family well supported, basically. So here, for example, we can see that if you can see my cursor, I hope you can see my cursor moving at the top. This figure here, the child chose a toy to represent her mum, and all of these emoji cards here represented the way she felt about her mum. So crazy, broken-hearted, often at times quite sad and quite angry, also happy but despairing, quite oblivious, and often tedious also. So for this young person, the relationship with her parents was very, very complex. We were also able to explore with the children who's making decisions on behalf of them, who's listening to them, who talks the most in their relationship and their visits with them, and who's actually in charge of their situations. And by using interactive resources, it let the child really consider how they felt without having to put things in words, which again, to enable really good levels of participation, it's important for children to be able to express themselves in a way that makes sense to them and not just me as the researcher. We did exactly the same thing for the parents as well, because I think sometimes when you're speaking to people and you're trying to find out about participation, it becomes quite a rigid questions and answers session. So for when I was speaking to parents, I developed a diamond exercise where parents could consider how their child was included in their own child protection planning, and they could actually rate their child's level of participation. And what this did is it enabled a dialogue between me and them to find out more about how they perceived their child's level of participation. So here, for example, the parent placed at the lowest level of their child's participation, their child's ability to read their own child protection plan. This parent thought that that wasn't appropriate because documents are often very formal and very, very sensitive. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth. But using participatory methods means that we can just trigger conversation. And like I said, it just takes the pressure off just sitting and speaking directly to people and having to look at them eye to eye. So, in child protection social work, we work on the basis, we follow statutory legislation, and in English law, we have the Section 53 of the Children Act 2004, and this is part of our legislation that says that in England, social workers have a duty to ascertain the wishes and feelings of the child regarding the action to be taken with respect to him. Now, this legislation requires practitioners to encourage and support children to have their voice heard and find out how the child feels regarding the social worker's intervention and the subsequent action plan. And then the social worker should give due consideration to the children's feelings. The term wishes and feelings, however, in my opinion, is a little bit contentious. It reads as whimsical and desire focused, yet the purpose of this legislation is to create meaningful participation and empower maltreated children and young people, and even prevent further abuse from happening. And I think in my experience as a child and family social worker, the default setting for wishes and feelings has ended up being a social worker writing what the child likes and dislikes. So, for example, a child may like to play football on a Saturday or go to the movies on a Sunday. And in my research, one of my youngest participants, Casey, told her advocate, when asked her wishes and feelings, that she wanted to go to France. And this is a bit of skewed translation from English law into practice, with social workers perhaps interpreting wishes and feelings as being emotional and desire focused rather than experiential and impacting. And this, in my opinion, blurs the links to participation, because wishes and feelings then just becomes a bit of a task or a tick box exercise. So again, in English social work, we have statutory guidance in England called Working Together to Safeguard Children, and it's a brilliant document. It promotes multi-agency social work and really lays out to practitioners working in children in need or child protection proceedings how we can support them and their families and what exactly needs to be done under what timescales. And it encourages social workers to seek children's opinions regarding the provision of social work services and promotes discussion on their ongoing plans with the children and the family. And they have a brand new section in the updated version called Children Have Said That They Need. And it addresses important issues that children have raised, including the ability to understand the actions of the social worker, to have that understanding acted upon, and to be informed and involved at every step of the way. So what are we struggling with? Because research continues to tell us that children feel that they're not listened to and that their views are not taken into account. So we're going to have a look, perhaps why not? And I apologise for all of this writing on the page at once, but I'm going to talk through a little bit of these concerns as to why perhaps we are not getting it right. So firstly, age-appropriate practice, and this is a quote from one of the social workers in my research. So you have a read through that quote while I'm just going to talk about age-appropriate practice. Now, for most of you involved in this webinar, you will have a deep-rooted passion to improve participation for all children and young people. So it will come as no surprise to you to realise that different countries around the world have different attitudes and rules and legislation regarding participation. And it's the same in social work, particularly child protection social work. For example, in Norway, children aged under 7 are supplied information and invited to express their opinion, whereas the views of children aged 12 years plus will be given weight. So they'll talk and listen to 7-year-olds plus, but when you're 12 in Norway, you will be allowed to really make a difference to the plans being made for you. So whilst this is good, in Norway, apparently Norwegian children are still not recognised as an official party in court. So advocacy in Norway is very, very important to them. Here in England, the invitation to participate in child protection proceedings very much depends on the local authority. And of course, there are many local authorities within England. So it also depends on the skills and the awareness of the social worker involved with the child and the family, and their perception of whether the social worker feels that the child is capable. But here we have a social worker saying that I struggle with young children. You don't want to put the fear into them, do you? And often with them, such as 8-year-olds, their parents are like their world, aren't they? So it's about getting that balance. So hitting the nail on the head for age-appropriate practice is very, very difficult. For relationship building and for direct work, I think that we always assume that social workers join our profession having an inbuilt ability to build relationships with people because that's where their passion is, and therefore just to know how to work with children. But that is definitely assumed. These things take time, they take skills, they take training, and they take practice. I know that I've spoken to many social workers who've over many years equip themselves with resources, toolbox, unique exercises to do with children. So for a newly qualified social worker, how will they know what to do? They won't. It definitely takes time. And these are skills that are going to be amassed along the way. So these are some of the barriers and challenges when it comes to embedding participation into social work. So staying on this topic of direct work with children, there seems to be a general theme when talking to children about direct work that their social worker have done with them, that perhaps we're duplicating things we do. And for example, Arthur, in my research, who's 11 years old, he said to me, I say things over and over again. I get asked the same questions over and over again. And I do this, and he hid his face, because it's the same stuff. Now, I don't know about you, but as an adult, if I'm made to do the same thing over and over, it's absolutely tedious. So for a child, this must be totally laborious. And when he was reflecting on this, Arthur, he chose the talk to the hand because the face ain't listening emoji, because he just said, I don't want to do it. And as a result of this one statement from Arthur, I had a long Twitter discussion last year with social workers from all over the world to say, how can we stop doing this? How can we create these new ideas in the way we talk to children? And we produced the most amazing Twitter thread with ideas of resources, questions, games that we can do with children. And even the terminology we use, I've just called this direct work. And in one of my training sessions a few weeks ago with social workers, one of the social workers said how anxious she feels when her manager says, go and do a piece of direct work with a child, because the phrase direct work doesn't mean anything. What is direct work? And straight away she starts to panic and think, what am I going to do? So that work with a child becomes a command to do things rather than an exploration of getting to know a child, finding out what's important to them, and trying to listen and change the way we work and the way we respond to them. That's what direct work actually is. So who are we? We are social workers, we know that. And whoever's attending this webinar, I'm guessing you're here because you are a practitioner who works with children and young people. We know who we are, but do the children we're working with actually know who we are? And in my research, I often found that sometimes as social workers, we don't do a very good job of explaining who we are, what we're doing, and why we are there working with that child. So we need to make sure that all of the children that we are working with have access to this information: our name, our office location, our telephone number, our email address. Because I think sometimes as practitioners, especially in England as a child protection social worker, I used to fall into the trap of leaving my name and telephone number with the parents and actually forgetting that the child needs my contact details too. So for example, here at the bottom of my page, I've reported that in my research I had 4 children who did not know their social workers' telephone numbers. So if they had an issue they needed to discuss importantly, they had no way of getting in touch with their social workers without their parents knowing. So Rebecca, you can see that quote from Rebecca there. And Rebecca went on to say that, you know, if I phone them up and tell them about what my mum's done or said or blah de blah, She doesn't like it because I'm blabbing on her then. And we have to respect that children and young people need that confidentiality to talk about issues that are important to them. So giving them a way to access our services is crucial. And this tiny little tweak could certainly be a way of developing and embedding participation of children in their own child protection experience. In my research, I found that nearly all of the children I spoke to absolutely loved their social workers. And of course, building good and trusting relationships with children and their families is a common theme throughout all social work literature. So, how do we sustain relationships with children when the turnover of social workers is so high? In my research, for example, 2 of the children I spoke to had had 2 social workers. Another 2 had had 3 social workers. One of them had had 3 social workers within 18 months. One child had had 5 social workers, and one, Tom, aged 10 years old, had had over 20 social workers. How can we do this? It's I can't answer that question. It's definitely a rhetorical question, because increasing workloads, poor pay in the sector, a lack of organisational communication, poor supervision, they're all issues linked to the high turnover of social workers in England. And for example, in 2016, the English Department of Education recorded nearly 4,500 child and family social workers joining the profession, yet nearly the same amount of social workers leaving the profession. So this is consistently diluting all of that lovely experience and participatory knowledge that social workers build up over time, because newly qualified social workers are welcomed into the profession, but they need to start from scratch. And the knowledge of children's rights and child development were identified as key skills lost on social work departure. So to be able to sustain these good quality relationships, we need to keep good quality social workers within the profession. One of the highlights of my research was to find that almost every child I spoke to was receiving advocacy. And as I've already mentioned, advocacy for children on a child protection plan should always be available. However, delving into this a little bit further, I found that similar to social workers, the advocates were not leaving contact details or telephone numbers with the children. So it meant that when advocates were visiting children who were on child protection plans, the children were expected to give their opinions at a time that was suitable for the advocate. So if, for example, the advocate leaves and the child has a great idea or remembers something that they should have said, there was no way of the child to get back in touch. And that's not good enough at all. And that's not participatory in any meaning of the word. We also found that there was a blurred boundary sometimes between the role of an advocate and that of a family support worker in one case. And that was the case of a young person, Rebecca, in fact. We've spoken about her before. And in her circumstance, her advocate had also taken on board a family support role. And one day she came home from school and she found that her TV had been removed from her bedroom. And this had been done without her consent, and she was told that it was to help her establish a better bedtime routine. Now, because this was done without her knowledge, and because Rebecca knew that the purpose of her advocate was to illuminate her voice and stand up for her rights, she was really annoyed. And as a result, she chose 3 emoji cards explaining the way she felt about her advocate. And I think that's enough said there. I'm really conscious I'm talking a lot, so I'm going to whiz through these last few slides. We need to consider how we can make child protection meetings welcoming to children. And I think, again, I know I'm speaking to you as being passionate about embedding participation in any sense, in any sector. And I'm sure you'll be aware that we come to this presumption sometimes that just because a child attends a meeting, we assume they're participating. And of course, we all know that that is not the case. We need to make sure that the child understands what's going on, that they understand their role as a fully valued member of that meeting, that they have opportunity to speak and be listened to, and that every ounce of that meeting is set up in order to welcome them. And if those systems aren't in place, it's probably best maybe that the child doesn't go, because it could possibly be more damaging than helpful. Now, research definitely shows that we still haven't got it right with helping children attend child protection proceedings. And in my research, I didn't get any examples at all of children attending meetings. I know that one child, Arthur, who was 10, he attended one of these core group meetings, so not an official child protection one, but a linked core group meeting. But he was just invited in the middle. So conversations had already started. He didn't know who the people were sat around the table talking about his life. And he'd missed the purpose. And it was kind of to him that he'd just been rolled in as a token afterthought. Luckily, he wasn't bothered, and he actually felt that he was listened to. But we need to make sure that we are always having children at the heart of the meeting. And if they are to be involved, they need to be the most important part of the meeting. We've already established earlier in this webinar that social work assessments and child protection plans are very formal, adult-focused documents, because let's face it, they have to be. Child protection social workers are often working in very tricky circumstances and very needed circumstances. But if we want to embed meaningful participation, we have to think of ways to let children know, again, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And my research found that there was very limited examples of social workers producing child-friendly material that they then sat and shared with the child. So some of the children weren't kept in the loop with regards to what was being organised for them. And for that reason alone, I can argue that participation isn't happening, because how can they then give their opinion if they're not aware on what is going done, what is being done for them? So Rebecca here says, it makes me feel like they don't trust me, because if they don't trust me to read it or anything, it makes me think it might be something that I'm not allowed to know, something upsetting, and they don't want me to get upset. Because if it was upsetting and my mum would tell me, and like, I'm in a good mood, like, because if I'm in a bad mood, it's even worse, because I'll start punching walls and everything like that. So Rebecca here is the perfect example of what we spoke of earlier about children imagining possibly things that are worse than what is actually written down. And Rebecca, at almost 13 years old, could surely be given some information that reassures her as to the work being done on her behalf. It's very, very important. So what can we do? I'm just going to summarize this webinar and suggest little tweaks that we as social workers, or we as people working with children on a regular basis, can make to our practice to embed meaningful participation and help children understand and be listened to. So firstly, we can explain to children who we are and why we are supporting their family. We can let them know where we are based and how we can be contacted. If the child has a group of professionals working with them, let them know about them. In my research, the children didn't know that they had a core group of professionals. Why not? Explain who these professionals are, what their roles are, and why they're involved in supporting their family, because children having this information may be reassured, or they may be able to go away and speak to these individuals and work with them, on their own privately. The children need to know who their support group is. We need to remember that children cannot be expected to participate at the drop of a hat. We as adults often aren't able to do that. I need time to process my thoughts, to think about things rationally, particularly when I'm upset about things. And children need this too. They need time to understand what's happening. They need appropriate information to be shared with them. They need a fabulous relationship with their social worker and a private opportunity to be spoken to and to be listened to. Sorry, I should have said spoken with and listened to. We never in social work try to do things to people. We're always doing things with them. A popular phrase in looked after children's social work is no meeting about me without me. And we need to be pushing this through at every opportunity. So if we're ever going to have a meeting about a child, consider how we can include the child in that meeting. So to be able to do that, we need to consider all of the aspects of that meeting, the formality, the language used, what time of the day it's being held, the location, the accessibility, and consider how we welcome a child. Have we got nice snacks? Have we got juice? Do the children know everyone that's there? Are we asking them all the time if they understand what's being said? And finally, social work assessments and plans are formal documents and very dull. We need to consider how we can share information with children in a child-friendly manner, and always consider how can we be co-producing these resources with the children. So instead of sitting behind the scenes and writing things to be done for the child, sit with the child and do it with them. Help them to tell you how they like to receive information. What's their way of processing? It may be by drawing pictures, writing diaries, cookery, taking photographs, going for a walk, sitting with a map and looking at community spaces. Only you will know the best way to work with a child that you're involved with. So consider always producing unique and bespoke resources before resorting to templates or things that may have been done over and over before. I'm going to draw this webinar to a close. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that I have stimulated a little bit of interest in participation in children's social work, particularly when children aren't aware that they're going to become a client. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy all of the other webinars in this series, and have a lovely weekend.